Well, a very, very warm welcome to everyone attending this webinar. I'm Catherine Howarth, the Chief Executive of Share Action, and I want to wish you a Happy New Year. It's great to be having this engagement with stakeholders of our work really early in 2024. And we're saying that as well as talking in detail today about this RISE guidance paper on stewardship and escalation. Today, we've also released Voting Matters, which is an analysis very relevant to escalation and stewardship, an analysis of voting by major asset managers across the world. So just flagging that up and encouraging people to take a look at it. So today, as I said, we're going to be talking in detail about the second paper in our RISE series. It's a new guidance series from Share Action, which is grounded in very detailed research and recommends actions that asset managers can, and in our view, should take in today's investment environment in pursuit of being a truly responsible investor. And this second topic in the series is about effective engagement through the use of escalation tools. And we very much believe that stewardship activity is central to being a responsible investment, and see escalation as a really important part of making stewardship credible and robust, and that effective escalation is really much needed at this time, given the scale and severity of the systemic issues that we face. We're also very conscious that engagement is challenging and resource intensive, and we'll talk about some of the dynamics and challenges around some of that, but really necessary to being a credible, responsible investment. So our view on the use and reporting of escalation is predicated on our belief that all asset managers should be active owners. They have significant influence over companies, and when clients entrust asset managers with their capital, we believe it's a relevant expectation of asset managers that they use the influence they have to represent the interests of those clients. And how we do that properly is the focus of this guidance. And we have 5 terrific speakers to take us through the topic today. First of all, my colleague Neil Considine, who's our head of investor standards, and he will set out in a bit more detail why we've chosen to look into escalation as a topic. And then my colleague Danielle will introduce the findings of our research into the current escalation landscape and some of the underlying principles on which our guidance is based, as well as the case for adopting the framework. And then my colleague Susanna will talk through some of the details on our 5 expectations and some of the toolkit that we've set out. And then I'm delighted that we have a couple of very expert external speakers, Kevin Chua, who's an academic, also, as it happens, a trustee of Share Action, who will provide a bit of an overview of the importance of active ownership. And then delighted that Clara Melo, who's a stewardship specialist at the PRI, will talk about the enabling and enhancing factors of escalation and give PRI's perspective on this. So thank you all very much in advance for the preparation and for the content you're about to share with everyone. We'll take about 35 minutes together for the speakers, and then I will chair a question and answer session, which I hope people will be much inspired to pour into with all sorts of questions. So with that, let me hand over to Neil.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. So why have we picked escalation as our second RISE topic? Well, we often hear from asset managers that focusing on voting, as we do in our Voting Matters report, which, as Catherine mentioned, is just out today, or focusing on investment policies, which is a component of our biennial point of no return survey, misses all the impactful engagement that managers do. Indeed, some will posit that engagement as the reason for sort of not having stronger investment policies or voting track records. But the problem is that there's much less measurable, comparable disclosure on engagement than on voting and investment policies. So we just don't have the same quality of picture on how engagement is being conducted, which makes it very difficult for stakeholders to assess whether an asset manager is engaging impactfully on their behalf or perhaps going through the motions. The demand for better information on engagement practice and effectiveness is something we hear frequently from a variety of stakeholders, including clients of asset managers. And that's reflected in a quote here on the right, about disclosure being pears, apples, and bananas. But we also hear it from asset managers themselves looking for guidance on how to provide better transparency on their engagement activities. Now, it's worth being clear that we at Share Action are big fans of engagement. Our corporate campaigns convene and coordinate engagement with companies. A significant portion of our surveys do cover and assess engagement activities despite the limitations of disclosure. But we believe engagement without consequence can be ineffective. If companies think there'll be no consequence, they have less incentive to meet investor asks. And that's where the application of escalation tools comes in. In our view, the persistence and urgency of the systemic environmental and social threats facing the world today warrant a much more concerted application of escalation tools. More consequence needs to be applied to catalyze engagement on these systemic issues. And of course, the role and efficacy of escalation in the face of these threats is well recognized, including across regulatory and industry bodies, such as those indicated on the slide here. Indeed, escalation is an expectation for implementing good, effective stewardship. Now, to set the scene, it might be helpful to set out what we mean by escalation. We think of it as mechanisms that intensify engagement when the response from a company to investor asks or concerns raised is proving insufficient. So this covers actions such as elevating concerns to the board, writing letters and publishing statements, collaborative actions, filing and voting on shareholder resolutions. We also include capital allocation within our escalation toolkit, so underweighting, partial or selective divestment, or fully exiting a position. Now, this might seem counterintuitive to some, and to be clear, we're not saying divestment is a form of engagement, but we are saying the potential for divestment brings the weight of consequence to engagement and can generate impetus behind investor asks. As such, it is part of the escalation toolkit. And divestment isn't necessarily inconsistent with constructive engagement. Reduced weighting or partial divestment gives a clear indication to the company of the seriousness of the issue at hand and that there are consequences to expectations not being met, while still keeping channels of dialogue open. And even full divestment can leave the door open for engagement if the reasons for divesting and the conditions for reinvesting are clearly communicated to the company. We recognize that capital allocation levers are different for passive funds, although they are still present in some form. Now, that places a heavier emphasis on the use of other tools in the escalation toolbox for passive managers to engage effectively. So coming back to where I began, there's an important point here in the relationship between engagement and escalation. We don't think voting or other escalation actions are an alternative to effective engagement. It's not an either-or choice. Rather, they're a core part of what can make engagement successful. In other words, we believe investors should engage and vote and have robust investment policies because they're all interlinked within effective stewardship. And to be clear, we're not saying that all engagement has to involve escalation or that reporting on escalation will provide a comprehensive picture on all engagement activities. Good engagement outcomes can be achieved without escalation. But we believe the plausible presence and the application of escalation will result in more good engagement outcomes. And following from that, we view reporting on escalation as being sort of a necessary component of reporting on engagement and its effectiveness overall. One final comment that I'll make is on the scope of the report, which encompasses direct engagement and escalation with companies through either listed equity or corporate bonds. Now, engagement in other arenas, such as with sovereign or supranational borrowers, with infrastructure assets, with GPs of private equity funds, and with policymakers and regulators, are all important and necessary avenues of influence. However, because the methods of engaging in these arenas can be different to direct engagement with corporates, we've limited the scope of this report, but we would strongly encourage the same thinking to be applied to other asset classes or relevant arenas. And so with that, I'll hand over to Danielle, who'll talk about the escalation landscape today and introduce our escalation framework.
Hi, Neil. Thanks very much for that. So I'll be talking about some of the original research that we did in order to support this paper. Before I go through the findings, I'm going to quickly run through the methodology. So as part of this, we went through the stewardship and sustainability reports of 50 of the largest relevant asset managers, meaning those with significant listed equity or corporate debt holdings. We then categorized that data based on elements of a good escalation policy and also any evidence of good escalation disclosure. And what were our findings? Well, if we go to the next slide, you can see on this chart that although 80% of these asset managers made reference to escalation, far fewer actually outline the elements that make escalation effective. This results in a picture of escalation where the disclosure is on and the disclosure and policies on this is limited, inconsistent, and vague. Just referencing time-bound milestones, i.e. whether they have any elements of time in their goals. You have, I'm so sorry, my screen has just cut out at the worst possible time. Apologies for that. I don't quite know what's happened. I think probably just.
I think we can still hear you okay,
We
Danielle.
can hear you, but if you can't.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe we could, someone could take over. Can you see Danielle? I must say you've frozen on my screen at least.
Shall I jump in for the
Maybe jump in, yeah. I think that would be
and
really helpful.
Danielle comes back, we can start again.
I'm so sorry, can you hear me? I might turn
yeah,
off
we can hear you.
my camera. Okay, I don't really know what happened there. Apologies for that. My screen went blank just as I was looking at the graph. So yeah, so sorry to continue with that rather dramatic interlude. So 6% of asset managers referenced the time-bound milestones, as I was saying before, whether the goals contain a reference to expected timing. 16% referenced the pace of escalation, which is how quickly they intended to move through the stages. And 14% referenced any outcomes for engagement that included both successful and failed engagements as part of the escalation. Why did this matter? As mentioned by Neil, and that quote from the asset owner that it's kind of apples, oranges, and pears. At the moment, this is a picture that we're getting an entire fruit bowl. This makes it really hard for clients, for other stakeholders to compare how escalation is being conducted at asset managers. And also, quite frankly, the fact that it's underreported results in a risk that, to at least some degree, escalation may be being underutilized. So our proposed solution to this is therefore to introduce a standardized framework for escalation. What is this framework? So this comprises of an escalation toolkit, which groups escalation tools into categories, an escalation pathway, which sets out the anticipated progress through that toolkit. We also include expectations on resourcing and reporting on that escalation framework. What do we think that this toolkit will allow for? So it will allow for a streamlined reporting of the use of escalation, which will enable clients and other third parties to better compare asset managers' practices and see if they align with their preferences. To the extent that this transparency reveals a say-do gap or a misalignment of ambition, this could catalyse a more robust, ambitious use of escalation, proportionate to the scale of the scale of the systemic, environmental, and social issues that we face. It's also key that it contains time-bound elements. Without them, there could be continued lack of progress year after year. This is particularly urgent and relevant in the context of certain issues, such as net zero, where there's a 50% reduction in emissions that's needed by 2030. A few people might be thinking, you know, how can a standardized framework be applied to different companies where every company and therefore every engagement is unique? We do recognize that, you know, no two engagements will be identical, but it is wrong to suggest that engagement and the use of escalation is wholly idiosyncratic. There are common escalation tools like voting, like asking questions at AGMs, like meeting with management that can be applied to many companies. There's also engagement to address systemic threats such as climate, which reflect shared risks and goals. The goal with this framework is to create a common reference for escalation that is designed to be applied flexibly to individual cases. So what are the benefits that we see coming out of this toolkit? As mentioned before, there's going to be a comparability of the process and the outcome for clients. There'll be transparency. This allows everyone to be on the same page. Investors are able to understand their asset manager strategies, and companies are able to anticipate what specific asks they will have asked of them. The third benefit is commonality. So this shows if there's any identification of overlapping goals and common purpose. And the final point, as we mentioned above, if there's any kind of say-do gaps, this may catalyze the scale and the speed of the response to systemic environmental and social challenges. I'll now pass over to Susanna to talk through the recommendations we've put together, which keeps all these principles in mind.
Thanks, Danielle. Glad we got you back. So as mentioned, we've put forward 5 recommendations for asset managers in the paper. These all support and they're in line with our framework. And we believe that adopting them can help improve escalation practices. So I'll just run through them one by one briefly now. So as you've already heard, when we looked at what is reported at the moment, we found that many engagement policies just simply don't give a clear picture as to the escalation approach, under what circumstances an asset manager would plan to start escalating and how they would go about it. So we therefore recommend that asset managers publish a transparent escalation policy which contains their toolkit. As Danielle said, that toolkit is effectively a list of tools the asset manager is set up and willing to use, categorised into buckets to give an idea of how strong each is considered to be. The policy should also include a definition of escalation, as this seems to mean different things to different managers. And we think the policy should clearly explain the investor's process for prioritising companies for escalation. Is it simply the worst laggards or companies in which the asset manager has its largest holdings, for example? Clearly stating all of this information within the policy creates transparency, which, as we've noted already, has a host of different benefits. So you can see here sort of expanded version of our suggested toolkit. The steps shown go in increasing strength from left to right. So beginning with private persuasion there, moving on to broader challenge, into from talk to action and so on. So it's worth noting that we would only see this toolkit kicking in where quality business as usual engagement is proving unsuccessful. We are also not proposing that every tool would be used within each step in every case. So it may be that for some companies, an investor applies just one step before moving forward, or in some that they miss out a step entirely. And what about the tools listed here that can't be used in other countries? So we appreciate that this is true of some of the tools shown here, and that there is also a sort of whole bundle of others that aren't even shown. So, for example, there's the scope to call a special audit in Germany, or the voto di lista mechanism in Italy. However, the graphic hopefully shows many that are often usable and demonstrates the idea of how an asset manager might display its toolkit. So that might lead you to believe we're asking investors to move up the scale, steps 1 through 5, in a straight line. This is not true in every case. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So firstly, asset managers can continue to use less intense steps, even as stronger options go live. So for example, they might continue to make public statements on an issue, even as they begin to reject bond documentation change requests. And within the framework, asset managers can also use some of the stronger tools without applying the earlier tools first. So voting and pre-declaring support for resolutions, for example, we see should be considered as part of basic stewardship hygiene. We feel it's really important for responsible investors to also support the escalations of others, even if they're not engaging directly themselves, to build legitimacy on reasonable asks. So we appreciate that escalation is rarely completely linear in reality, and the framework has been designed with flexibility in mind. However, we also think that most investors would agree that there are some tools, such as writing to management, which are generally seen to be less strong, while others, for example, seeking board seats, are at the stronger end of the scale. And in most cases, it's logical that investors will increase the strength of their actions over time if progress is not forthcoming. What the framework really looks to highlight is the strategy that investors are using to escalate. Is it changing in response to the situation, as shown in the chart here, or is it just repeating the same ineffectual actions and avoiding stronger tools, as shown in this second diagram? The second expectation that we've put forward is to publish sectoral expectations on core environmental and social factors underpinned by time-bound milestones. The example that we've gone for here is showing some expectations for companies in the chemical sector to do with climate action. There's that overarching expectation at the top to become 1.5 degree aligned, alongside a number of milestones along the way. Which sectors and themes are focused on would be up to the asset manager and depends on many factors such as client preferences and expertise, and would likely build up over time. Sectoral expectations should be in line with credible consensus-based frameworks, and milestones should be clear, smart goals. We appreciate that for engagement to really be fruitful, additional company-specific asks and milestones will also have to be in place to add further depth behind these top-level public ones. However, we believe having top-level asks public is important for transparency and can ask us red lines for actions with laggard companies. We're also asking for asset managers to disclose the anticipated pace of escalation one might expect to see if a milestone is missed. So if a milestone being missed is seen as deciding when the car engine is turned on, this pace of escalation is the speed at which the owner is planning to drive. In the example given here, the asset manager reports that for whatever this particular issue at hand is, they expect to progress to step 2 after 3 months, to step 3 after 9 months, and so on. Of course, these are only indicative timescales, and we appreciate they're quite short ones. So we'd expect the pace to be totally up to each manager and based around what is reasonable to expect, weighed against the urgency of the issue at hand and market landscape. And of course, in the real world, this anticipated pace won't always go to plan. An investor may have to wait for an AGM or want to accelerate a process due to an unforeseen incident. So the actual rate of escalation is therefore an indicator we've put forward in our reporting recommendation. Talking of which, the fourth recommendation is to measure and report comprehensively on the application of escalation. Categorizing escalation tools according to their strength facilitates a more streamlined reporting approach, rather than needing to comment on the use of every tool individually, while still giving more insight into how engagements are progressing. We've set out some suggested reporting indicators in the RISE paper. Also, on an important note, effective and organised escalation depends on the support of underpinning systems. Whichever system or software platform it is, investing into properly tracking your escalation is critical. And finally, it's essential that teams are resourced appropriately and their work is fully integrated into the investment process. Clients entrust capital to asset managers to invest and steward thoughtfully in their best interests. And if an asset manager has insufficient resources in place for stewardship, these interests may be underserved. And I know this is something that the PRI is working on together with Thinking Ahead Institute, and Clara is going to touch on it a bit more later. So in summary, we believe these recommendations combine to support escalation practices becoming more robust, transparent, ambitious, and outcome-driven. I look forward to taking questions at the end, but with that, hand back to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Susanna, Danielle, and Neil. A really helpful and clear layout of what's in this guide. I'd now like to introduce Kevin, who will be speaking about reasons for active ownership to give a bit of background context. So, Kevin, take it away.
Great. So firstly, I'd like to congratulate the ShareAction team on this really important work. It's useful for investors to have a comprehensive but also flexible roadmap for how they can use escalation within their overall investment toolkit. For my comments, I'll focus on two specific reasons why investors should be more involved in active ownership, especially in terms of engagement and escalation. So firstly, I'll talk about financial materiality, and then secondly, in the context of emerging systemic issues. For both of these, I believe there's strong arguments for why all types of investors would want to get involved in being active owners. Investors obviously care about their financial performance, and they'll want to clearly prioritize financially material issues related to sustainability in the same way that they might prioritize any other financially material issue. And on the other hand, it makes sense for investors to start engaging on emerging systemic issues like health, biodiversity, and workers' rights, good work. These have traditionally been at the margins of investors' considerations, but they will very likely become highly relevant in the future. So it's important that investors start developing their engagement capabilities on these issues now. So let's dig into both of these topics in a bit more detail. So on the next slide, I'll firstly talk about financial materiality. And we're fortunate in that we already have a very good set of standards that have been developed by SASB, which has become part of the IFRS Foundation. So SASB standards focus on sustainability issues that are likely to impact business value over the short, medium, and long-term timeframes. And I really want to emphasize the business value part here. These sustainability issues affect financial performance as much as any other type of issue. So if you're a traditional investor, you might care about a company's profit margins, right? Well, there could be important sustainability drivers of those profit margins. So if you're an investor meeting with a company's executives, it makes complete sense for you to be asking about those sustainability drivers of profit margins. Now, the great thing about the SASB standards is that they are tailored by industry to focus on issues that are more likely to be financially relevant for those companies. So, for example, if you're a mining company, then wastewater management obviously can affect your cost base. So it's important to ensure that companies in those mining industries are dealing with that, and that investors are on top of those issues so that they recognize the risks and opportunity within their investment portfolios. So I think it's clear that engaging and escalating on these financially material issues is consistent with investors' fiduciary duty to their beneficiaries. And in fact, I'd almost flip it on its head and I'd argue that if investors are not engaging on financially material issues, then I question whether they're actually fulfilling their fiduciary duties to their beneficiaries. So it's really important that escalation and engagement occurs specifically on these issues. So let's turn now to consider emerging systemic issues. So on the next slide, just thinking about 20 years ago, right? So this is before the SDGs, before the Paris Climate Agreement, before PRI was established, early days of ShareAction, right? In those days, climate change wasn't really thought of as a major consideration for investors to worry about. But look where we've come in that 20 years. Nowadays, so many investors are engaging on climate-related issues and are expressing those concerns to companies. I wish there'd be more of it, but still, we've got a critical mass now. And those investors have developed capabilities and even products that are focused on solving those sorts of challenges. So the question becomes, well, what's the next issues that we need to worry about in 5, 10, 20 years' time that is going to affect our pension payouts in the future, right? So what other systemic issues will eventually become like what climate has become today? How about health? How about biodiversity? How about ensuring good work? And you see a lot of these sorts of emerging issues within the Sustainable Development Goals. So why is engagement and escalation relevant here? So firstly, I'd argue that investors need to educate themselves about the potential effects of these issues on their portfolios and investments. Which of these risks will become relevant and how can they be managed within your investment portfolio? So that's the first one. Secondly, part of engagement is actually speaking to and learning from companies about what they're doing, right? So engagement in of itself can be educational for investors. So think about something like artificial intelligence, right? Investors can do their own research in isolation, not talk to anyone else, and learn about the risks of AI to their portfolios. But aren't investors better off speaking to the companies that are actually involved day to day on those issues, actually understand what it actually means for their capital allocation process, their operations, and the like. And the same goes for issues like biodiversity and health. So investors can learn from companies about what they're doing to reduce biodiversity loss and how they can develop products and other approaches to improving population health. So for these emerging systemic issues, investors can learn from that engagement, but then they can also look across companies within their portfolios to see, well, who's showing best practice? Who are the leaders? Who are the laggards? Who do we need to engage more deeply with once we're educated to then educate and assist those companies to become even better on those topics? Okay, I'll stop here, but just to reiterate the importance of engagement and escalation as part of active ownership. And I think that if investors think they need reasons to be involved in active ownership, hopefully understanding the relevance of financial materiality and the potential importance of emerging systemic issues are at least two convincing reasons for them to do that. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions later on.
Thank you, Kevin. Super helpful. And love the emphasis on financial materiality, but also, real kind of future facing, using these tools to tackle the things that are coming down the track for investors. So now let me turn to Clara Mello from the PRI. Delighted to have you with us, Clara, and really looking forward to your perspective and sharing PRI's work and program in this area.
Thank you, Catherine, and I'll also join Kevin in congratulating ShareAction. Thank you for the opportunity to join and for the speakers for providing a clear look at the case and framework for escalation. I'll focus on factors that can enable or enhance efficient stewardship and escalation in my presentation today. Starting with the first slide, please. So I think Kevin has made a clear case when it comes to duty, so I'll go straight to considering the rights because they enable and support the discharge of duties. And obviously there's some variation depending on share or asset classes, but in terms of listed equity, shareholders have formal rights as owners to publicly and transparently escalate important matters. So it's a matter of rights, and they can directly interact with the company's boards in that respect. So obviously it's about being able to attend AGMs, voting on resolutions, accounts, reports, remuneration plans, also director nominations. In some jurisdictions as well, it can mean pre-disclosing their votes. And there was an FT article recently on the impact of NBIM's pre-disclosures, which is a very interesting read. The rights to file shareholder resolutions as well and nominate directors. There's also more broadly outside of investor rights, generally the right to seek redress in court, and litigation is something that's gaining traction as a means to address severe failings. And something that's I think is very important to highlight here is that although these rights can be used for escalation, beyond that, they are first and foremost an integral part of the normal activities of an investor. And this is something that Neil highlighted as well. So it's a hygiene factor. Conversely, company directors have duties, and there is broad consensus that although they may vary from one jurisdiction to another, both fiduciary duties encompass a duty of care and the duty of loyalty, including with regards to the shareholders' interests. So that means that investors should expect and seek board accountability, which is a key concept in exercising efficient escalation. And last year we looked at majority proposals, contacted investors, and we found that in approximately a quarter of cases, the investor proponent believed that the proposal would not be addressed at all. So for investors who think that, you know, a resolution is already a big step and passing it is a great win, it is, but it's still not the end, and you need to keep an eye on the ball. Going on to the next slide, something that ShareAction highlighted very well. Stewardship is resource intensive, particularly where escalation activities are needed, and they form an integral part of stewardship practices. So while better resourcing is not guaranteed to deliver better outcomes, its absence is guaranteed to doom it. And I'm quoting a colleague here, but I just really like this phrase. There's a growing recognition in the industry that stewardship is under-resourced. In 2019, the Thinking Ahead Institute found that resources were increasing in absolute terms, but when looking at the world's 6 largest investment managers, that growth was not commensurate with asset growth or the overall number of employees. Likewise, Reddington recently released their Sustainable Investment Annual Survey, and they found that 45% of surveyed managers had a 0 headcount dedicated specifically to stewardship and engagement. So as Susanna mentioned, this is something that the PRI will be looking into, and you can look forward to a report where we'll comment findings about the industry survey we conducted, as well as recommendations as to what adequate stewardship resourcing might look like. On this point of resourcing, obviously it is good to see that stewardship codes like the UK's actually acknowledge the importance of resources. And to quote the RISE report, credible and impactful engagement requires effort and expertise. Asset managers should ensure that they have sufficiently invested in the resources to be able to conduct this type of deep engagement across companies and sectors. And with this, it means looking not only at quantity and in the shape of capacity, but also the quality of resources. And again, this is something that ShareAction highlighted: expertise, levels of integration, and oversight. The allocation of resources is something to consider as well, even if the increase might be something that's a pain point. And here, I'll just really quickly highlight that collaboration among investors can be a great way to split the burden, and I'll go back to that. So this resourcing needs to be scrutinized, and there needs to be more transparency so that in client-manager conversation, resource expectations and practices can be discussed, increased, and aligned. Then going to the next slide, something else that we want to keep in mind is the issue of selection, appointment, and monitoring, particularly from the asset owner's view. There can be misalignments between managers and their clients, from expectations and policies to actual discrepancies in voting and engagement practices. And this can dilute the power of stewardship. This can reduce the appetite for engagement and lead to ineffective escalation or even the lack thereof. In the UK last year, we saw a group of asset owners commission a review of how their long-term interests had been served by their managers in the context of proxy voting at major oil and gas companies. And that review had found that there was there was varying degrees of misalignment in voting behavior. So this is something to consider. How are managers escalating for you? And this is something that asset owners or clients, because you can also have managers who externalize part of their effort, need to hold managers to account and use their position to drive better stewardship standards and better escalation strategies and practices in the market. That can be done at multiple steps of the relationship, when setting their own responsible investment, stewardship, and escalation policies, when selecting managers and doing diligence on them, when appointing them by embedding requirements, for example, on escalation into legal documents, but also when monitoring managers through the evaluation of their stewardship practices, including looking closely at their use of stewardship tools for escalation. And the work that Share Action has done in terms of highlighting the question of pace is very useful here. I'll just give a quick nod to a publication that was written by one of my colleagues and released last year, which is a set of 2 tools called Evaluating Manager Stewardship for Sustainability. It contains a DDQ to help investors ask the right questions to their managers, and a short evaluation tool to categorize the kind of responses that they're getting in the form of a DDQ. So obviously, we hope that this kind of work complements the effort of organizations like Share Action by incentivizing asset owners and managers to design comprehensive and robust policies and escalation frameworks like the ones we're discussing today. And moving on to my last slide. Other elements that can contribute to enhancing efforts that relate to escalation. Collaboration, as I mentioned before, can increase the weight of investor demands in the eyes of companies, and as such is an important tool. I'll take a short advertising break here. Once you've read the escalation guide, if you haven't done so already, I also recommend you have a look at Kevin's research on collaborative engagement. When it comes to collaboration, it's very important to realize that some system-wide issues really necessitate that. They cannot be addressed by investors however, on their own, however strongly they escalate. And while some investors may collaborate to maximize influence and achieve greater impact, it's also, again, useful to think about a way to pool resources and share costs. This can facilitate participation by smaller and resource-constrained investors, which is advantageous, particularly in cases where markets are highly fragmented, because that can be a reason why investors feel that it's difficult for them to escalate when their voice is comparatively smaller. And last but not least, in seeking to achieve stewardship objective, in addressing sustainability risk and pursuing outcomes, particularly when it comes to systemic issues, it's important that investors consider opportunities to look at a broader perspective, look at market stewardship, engaging with policymakers, service providers, and other stakeholders. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Clara. That's great. And we've presented a lot of quite dense and really, I think, very, very strong material, but I'm keen to now open up for questions. And I saw there's one from Jess Wood, which would be great to start with. And that her question was about how this links to and builds on the IIGCC's Net Zero Stewardship Toolkit, and how can we help investors navigate across the different frameworks to deliver the most impactful escalation. So I'm going to, if you're okay with that, hand that to you, Neil, to give a response on that, and then we'll, but also inviting other people who've tuned in and listened to share any questions you may have. I think the way to do that is in the question and answer rather than live. It is, so please do type them in, and we'll make sure they get answered. Neil.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. No, really good question. Thanks, Jess. And I think Clara just spoke about kind of complementary guidance and frameworks and pieces of research, and that's kind of very much the aim here. There's a lot of really good work being done in different pockets of how we address systemic crises and the role of investors in helping do that, and how engagement should be conducted. And certainly the IGCC's report on net zero stewardship is really helpful. I think Kevin alluded to the emerging crises being obviously much more than just climate, and really spanning a whole range of issues across environmental and social. So our framework is very much intended to accommodate, and we've tried to reference in our paper some of those really helpful existing frameworks that we think what we're proposing here encompasses, accommodates, and sort of sits alongside.
Great. Thank you very much, Neil. And then we've got also a great question from Alex Wilkes around the thinking on how asset owners might address the increasing fragmentation of escalation by large managers, and thoughts on letting each asset owner decide how to vote their shares rather than have managers do that on their behalf with their own clear escalation red lines and deadlines. Some definite tensions there. So Kevin, I know you have thoughts on that, and then I'll also open it up to the Share Action team authors as well. And actually, Clara, if you want to pile in on that, please do. Kevin.
Yeah, I'll just specifically speak to the point about letting asset owners decide how to vote their shares. I think in principle, it's a nice idea, further democratization of views. But in practice, I struggle a bit with it, because it puts the onus and the responsibility back onto the asset owner to make these very fine-grained decisions. And if you're an asset owner with thousands of look-through holdings across all your investments, you could be asked to do the job of the asset manager, and that's what you're paying the asset manager to do. So what I think could be more helpful is what's actually in a lot of this report, which is that the asset managers are providing details about their escalation approaches, so that when asset owners are actually selecting the asset managers and paying fees to asset managers, they're seeing what value they're getting for those fees. What service are they getting in terms of the engagement and the escalation in return for the fees they're paying the asset manager.
Great. Clara has her hand up too on that one.
Yes, I would add that there's also some hybrid models where you can have an idea of general guidelines of how shares could be voted, and you can kind of pick based on different models, and that's an interesting middle ground. But I would echo what Kevin said, in the sense that, at least from a resourcing perspective, a lot of asset owners do not necessarily have the capacity to make the most of this option. And therefore, that's why the aspect of setting up your policy and engaging with asset managers, focusing on the selection, appointment, and monitoring aspect, can be a good alternative in terms of efficiency.
Yeah, and Neil, can I prompt you on this question of how asset owners might address the increasing fragmentation out in the landscape? Because we see it again with Voting Matters today, Share Action's analysis of voting last year. There's just extraordinarily different approaches being adopted in terms of the level of ambition, frankly, across the asset manager landscape. And what do you think is an appropriate response from asset owners to that?
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think I'd reiterate points that Kevin and Clara made. And I guess investing, you can ultimately capture different investor preferences in different funds and different mandates. The attempt to sort of democratize voting potentially does some of that, but with the issues that Kevin's outlined, that not all asset owners are resourced for that. But I think kind of what's important to remember is engagement. Like, an asset manager only has one engagement voice. And so when it's engaging, unlike when it's investing, it has to reflect the full scope and scale of all its investors' interests or clients' interests and preferences into that one engagement voice. And I think if you, coming back to engagement and escalation and being fundamentally linked in the application of consequence, if you have a single engagement voice and the consequences are voting that can be, dispersed and pushed off to the asset owners, or investment practices that can reflect specific preferences, you're losing some of that power, that ability to genuinely use the escalation tools to make sure your one engagement voice is a fair reflection and a sort of sincere reflection, if you like, of those various interests.
Thanks. And then we also have a question about debt and equity levers working together for escalation. Susanna, do you want to have a crack at that one?
Yeah, sure. I guess the first thing to say is that we think that bondholder stewardship is incredibly important. So very keen to see bondholders, coming to the table and using the levers that they do have at their disposal to also undertake robust stewardship. And that's partly why we've got the kind of second row in that framework, which is all about fixed income and the levers that can be pulled there. I think in general, they need to work together really closely. So, really the teams be integrated, and even if they're not the same person, be speaking to each other all the time, and strategizing in a way which, best makes use of the different rights that each group has at their disposal.
Good. And I think it's worth saying that Share Action is keen to do more work on bondholder stewardship and to see that work connecting very closely with well-established work streams with equity investors in the which we're already working on. So watch this space and do get in touch with us if bondholder stewardship is something that you want to explore more. Also, a quick question from Sunava Gautvik, which is asking about the viability of having one set of expectations for each sector when companies in those sectors can be so different and be starting from such different places. And Danielle, if you're there, I wonder if you want to take that one. I can't see you, but hopefully we can hear you again.
Yeah,
Yay!
sure. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, my camera for some reason won't be turning on. Yeah, so I mean, I guess to answer the question, I mean, the first thing is that we would kind of recommend a degree of prioritization in the sector. We're not necessarily expecting asset managers to have detailed sectoral expectations for every, if they hold 0.1% of assets in that sector, obviously that's not practicable. So I think there's a degree of prioritization which we discuss further in the paper about determining, which crises are most relevant to the asset manager. I think the second thing is yes, each company is very different and will be starting from different places. There is flexibility on that, but on the other hand, there are some very clear sectoral kind of sectoral guidelines that are based on, for example, if we're thinking about net zero, that are based on science. The IIGCC was mentioned earlier, and they have some really good I think they call it a staircase in their net zero stewardship guide that's worth taking a look at. And I think the other thing to say as well is that there's obviously a degree of flexibility, and I think the main thing is that at the moment asset managers are just not being transparent about what they expect from companies and when, and so there really just needs to be more disclosure to start with on this. I don't know, Susanna.
Yeah, that's Susanna and also Neil may have things to.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate the point made earlier as well about it not being the only expectations that are being set out, so it being kind of supplemented by these deeper, more company specific asks as well. So effectively the public expectations are helping set out red lines for the real kind of laggards, so how what you can expect from the bottom of the pack that you're engaging with, and stating how the kind of absolute minimum that you might expect in terms of your engagement. But really important to have a very deep understanding of the company as well, and be engaging with them on much more kind of granular milestones at the same time.
That makes a lot of sense. Clara?
Yes, also something to add in the sense is that we're not necessarily comparing companies as a whole, in the sense that we're not, some might be working across multiple countries, be a different size, a lot of, across lots of sectors. We're looking at how, what's important is looking at how a company reacts to an issue that's specific to a sector or kind of activity, and this is more easily comparable. So to a certain extent, while you want to consider the company's own characteristics, there is aspects that are very much comparable. And for the same reason, you're able to actually look at the financial performance of a company and understand if someone is clearly a laggard, or in terms of the advanced practice, or whether it's not. And I think a good example of the fact that it is workable is looking at in big investor initiatives like CA 100+, where you have overarching goals set at the top level, and then that is the skill of the engagement team that's put together to understand what that means for that specific company. And that also links back to why it's so important to dedicate time and resources for investors to understand exactly how they're going to have to adapt their asks.
Yeah, and I might even add in a point of my own here. We've talked a lot, and there's no getting around the fact that high quality and intensive engagement is very resource intensive. But in our experience at ShareAction, where key companies in a given sector, as a result of some escalation, have made quite significant moves to address concerns, it often has quite a rapid ripple out effect across that sector. And you then quite quickly see the adoption of good practice elsewhere in the sector, and it becomes much easier and much less resource intensive to achieve the same steps and outcomes from other companies in the same sector. So I do think that it can be very, very important to think about those sectoral spillover effects, which can be very positive and systemically beneficial. Good. Well, we're coming up to the hour, and I just want to really thank, oh gosh, we've got a couple more questions, but we're also coming up to the hour. So I'm going to just pose those questions, but also offer to come back to people so that we do finish the session on time. One of them was, are there any recommendations to align local legal practices to facilitate the engagement between investors and investee companies? E.g. escalation period limited to 2 weeks before the AGM, minimum holding threshold. I think that is probably more granular than we've got to in the guide, but we can absolutely take that away and think about what might be appropriate recommendations on that. So thank you, very interesting question. Also, do you see any ways for application of the escalation frameworks in the ETF sector by way of tracker funds? That's also a really good question, which I'm not going to suggest we answer now, but we will come back. That was from Brett Jacobs, so we know exactly where to come and find you, Brett, with the answer to that. Neil has his hand up, so I'll maybe hand over to Neil to finish the session up, if you're happy to do that, Neil. But I will say a big thank you to everyone involved in the development of this really important new guidance document. I think it's a fantastic way for ShareAction to start the year. I hope it's just the beginning. I know it's just the beginning of really good content from ShareAction, and big thank you to people for attending the session as well. Looking forward to engaging with all of you through this year on stewardship and much else. Neil.
Well, sorry, I was only going to address very quickly the tracker fund and the ETF comment, and I think, more broadly passive funds. And I guess, yeah, we agree that capital allocation lever is less dynamic for a passive investor or a passive fund. The allocation lever does still exist, right? You can create products with inclusion criteria that encompass alignment to, your core expectations, and then draw client attention to the benefits of migrating into those products. You can engage with the index provider to, remove misaligned companies at the next rebalancing. So the capital allocation lever is there, but it is less dynamic. And so to our mind, that puts greater emphasis on the use of, the other escalation levers by passive managers. And there's potentially a sense that you could argue if a passive manager is investing, across the market, in other words, in an index or every constituent in an index, they might be expected more often to see cases where they're not agreeing with the company's strategy or approach to these big systemic issues. As you might expect a passive manager to be more frequently sort of discerning or critical of a portfolio company, and therefore needing to deploy, not just engaging with them, but deploy escalation tools to further that engagement.
Great response. Good. Okay, well, let's leave it there. And many, many thanks for tuning in. Cheerio.
Thank you.